All right, everyone. So welcome. It is a great pleasure to be welcoming you here today on behalf of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston. And we are honored to be organizing this event on Professor Ussama Makdisi's latest book, The Age of Coexistence. In my view, this is one of the most important books to have appeared in the field in the past decade. It is the culmination of more than 25 years of reflection, thought, and research on questions of sectarianism, anti-sectarianism, difference, and transition from the Ottoman imperial structure to the state structures that we currently see in the region, and of course, the colonial role in shaping that transition. All of these themes are amply discussed in this book, and they will be reflected on by this incredibly distinguished lineup of speakers that we have today. I was not surprised when all of them agreed to come, because Ussama is held in great esteem in our field. He is highly respected by some of the most influential historians, and definitely we have several of them with us today.
Well, I'm so happy to be part of this panel that engages and celebrates Ussama Makdisi's Age of Coexistence. And reading this splendid book, I was struck by how many of the major struggles and disappointments that have marked the modern history of the region came into a new kind of focus, thanks to Ussama's deeply reflective and informed exploration of the intellectual underpinnings of coexistence. And I would add that on a personal note, it really helped me make more sense of my first experiences living in the Middle East, in Lebanon and in Egypt in the 1970s. It was a time, I now realize, when the ecumenical frame still actively shaped the ideas and actions of many Arab writers and political actors, although it was increasingly coming under the enormous pressures that Ussama describes in his epilogue. It was very much alive, however, and I think in retrospect, the promise of that time was central to my decision to become an academic focused on the region. So many thanks to Ussama for shedding new light on that period for me. I'd like to begin by mentioning just two aspects of this book that I very much appreciated as a historian of the Middle East. There are many more that I could raise, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will be doing just that. So I'll just mention two of these things, and then I'll move on to some of the questions that arose for me as I read. First, Ussama displays not just a mastery of, but also a profound respect for other scholarship on the intellectual history of the late Ottoman and Mandate periods. He gives full attention to the work of historians, both contemporaries and predecessors, who write and wrote in English and in Arabic. Too often, I think, works of grand narrative falter when it comes to recognizing the contributions of other scholars. This book, on the contrary, engages trajectories of scholarship that have grappled in their own ways with the theme of coexistence in the Ottoman Empire and Mandate periods. So there are actually two narratives here. One is the narrative of the ecumenical frame and its development over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And the other is a history of the scholarship that is relevant to this question from the 1930s and 40s works of George Antonius and Albert Hourani, right up to the most recent generation of scholars like Carol Hakim or Jens Hansen. There is a generosity of spirit on the part of Ussama when it comes to the work of others in the field that deserves to be applauded and emulated. A second aspect of the book I'd like to mention is the way Ussama handled the ubiquitous problem of Middle East exceptionalism. He reminds us gently and consistently over the pages of the book that the history of the region belongs to a global context, that the challenges the Ottoman Empire and its successor states faced were challenges common to states in other parts of the world as they grappled with a global 19th century political revolution. As he puts it, and I quote, "The challenge of political inclusion has plagued every secular state in the modern era. The discourse of citizenship and equality was everywhere fraught, from anti-Blackness in the US to anti-Semitism in Europe to the deeply exclusionary racial civilizational discourses of modern European empires. And later developments in the Middle East, such as the claims of despotism to be the guardian of pluralism, find their parallels in the imperial claims to be the standard bearer of liberal ideology. Indeed, the persistence of ecumenical thought in the Middle East compares very favorably with aspirational projects of inclusion elsewhere. So this history of sectarianism and anti-sectarianism in the Middle East, firmly located in a global frame, constitutes what I think is a very powerful and incontestable refutation of Middle East exceptionalism. Now, I'd like now to turn to three questions, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say three areas where I think this book sets us future research agendas. One of the hallmarks of a great book is how it invites us to think differently and head in new scholarly directions, how it encourages shifts in our perspectives and our research plans. So I'll share a few of my thoughts about what I've found both inspiring and provocative, and I would invite Ussama to weigh in, I hope, on what he sees as the possible future directions. First, in connection with the global frame, I was struck by the very occasional mention of intellectuals in the diaspora who made contributions to ecumenical thought, not least among them Amin Rouhani. Given the massive movement of Ottoman Christian subjects to the New World, which Ussama comments on for sure, as well as their sustained attachments to their homelands and their propensity to establish Arabic newspapers and salons in both North and South America, I think we can ask about their contributions. Were these contributions to the fashioning of the ecumenical frame significant well beyond their numbers? Ussama does briefly suggest in the book that, and I quote, they inadvertently bolstered the ecumenical frame, but I found myself really wanting to learn more about this. There are a number of questions we might pose here. Was there something about the nature of their experience as immigrants, as being out of place, that inflected their views of coexistence? Did they tune into the anti-Black or anti-Catholic currents in the US, or in the case of South America, the anti-Indigenous? And did they make analogies that brought the sectarian into better focus for them? And how well were their voices heard back home? I mean, since we know that some returned, okay, so let me just try to pick up. I really apologize. I don't know what happened. A sudden collapse of the internet here, but so yes, I mean, I was really asking about, was it if their voices were heard and how were they heard? Was it more common for New World exclusions to translate into a reinforcement of difference and perhaps even the introduction of new ideas about race or civilization? Is there any indication that the communalism in a place like Mount Lebanon took on some of the coloration of anti-Blackness or anti-indigeneity, say? In brief, how much does the development of the ecumenical frame owe to these migrants? So, I mean, that's the first area that struck me as perhaps worthy of some further consideration. A second area I'd like to ask about lies in the role of women and gender in this narrative. And this is not a focus of the book, and nor should it be necessarily. I never think that authors should write the book that you want them to write. They should write the book that they want to write. But Ussama certainly does pay some attention to women and gender, and he raises a very interesting tension, I think, as he does. He notes that the women's movement reflected the ecumenical age by reproducing its class and communal biases, as well as through its preference for reformed religiosity over secularism. But women, he is also quick to mention, experienced inequalities in ways that crossed class and communal lines. They had shared goals, such as better access to education, more egalitarian marriages, changes in divorce and child custody laws. At the end of the day, however, he suggests that women accepted communal, social, and legal boundaries and incorporated them into the work of the women's movements. So I think we could raise some questions here. There is some very evocative recent work on the Turkish women's movement, and I am indebted to my former student, Merve Tahirulu, for bringing it to my attention. Recent historians of the movement, of the Turkish women's movement, have been very struck by the propensity of Turkish women intellectuals to find common cause with their Armenian, Greek, and Kurdish counterparts, long past the time when the rise of Turkish ethno-religious nationalism had fractured men's relationships across these communities. On the eve of the First World War, Turkish feminist women were still writing essays and novels that recognized the sisterhood of women of these other communities. It was only in the aftermath of the war, with the collapse of the empire and the War of Turkish Independence, that the Turkish women's movement took its definitive turn towards exclusive ethno-nationalism. And we also have evidence from the Mashriq of serious commitments to anti-sectarianism on the part of women's movements. Elizabeth Thompson documents how the Women's Union of the 1920s in Syria and Lebanon was established and operated as cross-sectarian and Arab nationalist. And Ellen Fleischman makes the case that class and educational affiliations inevitably trumped sect in the Palestinian women's movement of the Mandate period. So in all these cases, Turkish, Syrian, Lebanese, and Palestinian, aspirational anti-sectarianism was very much on display and was being performed in the public representations and demonstrations of the women's movements. I think this history raises some interesting questions for future discussion of the role of women in the development of the ecumenical frame. Did elite women foreground coexistence more explicitly than did elite men? Did the connections that women made as a result of their shared positionality, the fact that their experiences as women had so much in common regardless of community, did that result in a different vision of coexistence, one that was actually more secular in spirit, even if constrained by male policing of communal boundaries? I agree that women could gravitate toward the tactic of what Ussama terms reformed religiosity, a turning to their separate religious spaces to try to effect the changes they sought. But I would suggest that it was a shared tactic, even if carried out in different spaces, and that it could just as well bring them together in common cause as divide them. Separate battles, but very much part of the same war, and perhaps coordinated and jointly strategized from time to time. So we could complicate the picture further with attention to the growth of trans-regional contacts, especially in the 20th century, when women came into closer communication across political borders. The Pan-Arab Women's Conferences and the Eastern Women's Convenings of the 1930s and 1940s raised demands for equal education, equal pay, healthcare, women's suffrage, minimum marriage age, things that were to apply across the boundaries of communities. And these were demands that pretty much all the active women could get behind. So how do we balance these demands of universal appeal and applicability across the time, against the time and focus women devoted to more community-specific targets? I don't think we have a good sense yet of how various demands were being prioritized and what that meant for the conscious transgression of communal boundaries. But at a minimum, women do not seem to be passive followers of a model of coexistence designed by men. Third and last, I'd like to raise some questions about personal status law, which occupies a place of some significance, I think, in Ussama's account. If I have read it correctly, the maintenance and development of communal personal status law has both circumscribed and enabled the ecumenical frame. On the one hand, it is the most conservative element. The inegalitarian, gendered, and religiously informed laws of personal status inscribe communal boundaries in social lives. These laws block movement toward a truly secular society of equal citizens. On the other hand, the laws of personal status are what Ussama terms, and I quote, a condition of possibility for the modern ecumenical frame. They work to reassure communities that their religion is still relevant to intimate life, that there is a communal bulwark against fears of secularism and assimilation. All the states of the Mashriq, including the revolutionary ones, have retained personal status law, as Ussama notes, as the key to reconciling religious diversity with the rule of law and equality. And Ussama also seems to suggest that there is a strong connection between the retention of these laws and the absence of religious or ethnic cleansing, although it was not clear to me how exactly you thought, Ussama, about the cause and effect in this context. And if these laws are the condition of possibility for the ecumenical frame, are you implying that they are a necessary condition, that their shortcomings are a necessary evil for a greater ecumenical good? We do gain valuable insight here into the perennial question of why it has proven to be so difficult to undertake any serious reform of the regime of personal status, to say nothing of abolishing it altogether in favor of a secular legal code. But I am left with several questions that we might pursue. I'll try to wind down fairly quickly here because I know that we lost time with the interruptions. But let me just say first that personal status law comes across as something of a redoubt, I think, an inert repository of siloed community identity. The history of the law as a field of intellectual endeavor and popular struggle remains somewhat in the background. The resonance of personal status law for various communities is taken at face value as primarily a marker of identity. Would we gain something by attending more closely to the history of this law in the 19th and 20th centuries? By exploring, for example, the ways in which the language of rights and justice at a personal level was tied to religious laws and religious courts, or by tracing the evolution of legal strategies that were employed by Muslims, Christians, and Jews that crossed the lines of community and class. What I am trying to suggest here is that laws of personal status, including the transformations of the modern period, were the products of a long history of evolution in a context of religious diversity. The modern versions of these laws are the product of interactive coexistence, not only the markers of segregation and sectarianism, and we should probably be taking this into account. And then secondly, the laws of personal status seem to be stacked up against something that might be better, more egalitarian, less gendered. Is this a secular family law of European or American design? I suspect not. I suspect that's not what Ussama has in mind. We are all well aware of the long struggle and ongoing legal battles that have been waged and are still being waged to try to achieve racial, gender, and class equalities under the laws of liberalism. What then is the alternative? Is it better to have a playing field that you know, a legal language that has deep cultural resonance? And isn't it easier and perhaps safer to struggle for equality and rights on home terrain? In any case, these battles for reform of personal status law are continuing ones. And a final looming question for the future of the ecumenical frame: can the laws of personal status be stripped of their inequalities and yet retain their treasured distinctions. So personal status law is not at all the focus of this book, but I think it does go to the final question Ussama poses as to whether the ecumenical frame can be salvaged. Part of reimagining the ecumenical frame will have to include consideration of how Muslims, Christians, and Jews will arrange their lives under family laws in ways that accommodate their sense of cultural tradition, yet provide for all kinds of intercommunal relations. And so this may well be a key challenge of the road ahead. I'll end with my gratitude for such a good read. This is a book of insight and erudition that truly inspires and also stirs things up. And I am very much looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and of course, also from Ussama Makdisi. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Judith. I wasn't able to continue my introduction of you, but I think the audience would have gotten a sense of the fact from your comment of the fact that that you're one of the world's leading experts on gender, Islam, and personal status laws, for that matter, in the region in both the 19th and 20th century. Judith, there is a request for you in the chat room for a link to one of the books you mentioned, by the way. So you might want to address it. Now, next we move on to Professor Jamil Aydin. And Professor Aiden teaches at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He focuses on both modern Middle Eastern history, but also modern Asian history. And he emphasizes on the connectivities, the international connectivities of the intellectual histories of the Ottoman and Japanese empires. He talks about transnational racial and civilizational identities in his work. He looks at Muslim, Asian, and African intersections. So he has a wide range of work on these questions. He's the author of The Idea of the Muslim World, A Global Intellectual History, which appeared with Harvard University Press in 2017, I believe. He's also the author of The Politics of Anti-Westernism in Asia, Visions of World Order in Pan-Islamic and Pan-Asian Thought, which was published by Columbia University Press. I could go on and on, but let's hear from Jamil about Ussama's book. And it is a great pleasure to be hosting you today, Jamil.
Thank you, Professor Takriti, and thank you to the Center for Arab Studies at Houston University. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should note that I received the book last year, immediately after it came out, and to review it. In fact, I think I have one of the first published reviews of the book in the Journal of Oxford Islamic Studies. And the moment I start reading the book, I was in the garden and I finished it in one single day. And as Abdel Razzaq was saying, Abid was saying that this is one of the most important books in the last several decades. I will say maybe in 4 decades, and I will refer to Edward Said's Orientalism. In some ways, and in many ways, I do think that this is a book in some ways complementing Professor Said's book on Orientalism. And if you think of the book on Orientalism as some sort of a vaccine against anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism, we do now know that the racialization of Arabs and Muslims are actually done by history, by historical arguments. And it's not a skin color racism. And Edward Said was trying to show that, how a certain narrative of history produced a racialization of Arabs and Muslims. But what we learned in the last 6 months, or now we are learning that this type of, if you think of racism as a sickness and a virus, it can mutate in very different forms. And one of the reasons why I was really excited about this book is that it is in some ways giving the booster shot of Orientalism and sort of anti-Arab racist narrative of history in the sense that it is clarifying many of the arguments that is used to racialize Muslims. And one of the main arguments that you see around, and I see everywhere among our colleagues, is this argument, is that yes, modern Middle East is in crisis. Yes, European empires may be responsible, colonialism and mandate, but you have to accept that there was nothing there before. This area was already doomed to fail, irrespective of European imperialism or not. And it actually gives a very pessimistic outlook on the future. I mean, if Orientalism is basically a judgment on the past, present, and the future of the Arab world, to say that you're doomed to fail, no hope for you. And there are reasons when we see around, one tends to get pessimistic. And the reason why I actually wrote another review of this book, I co-edited, which is going to come out in late May in the H. Diplo, with 5 other colleagues, is actually, the book is almost what a great historical scholarship. So when you read it, you realize, wow, I have been reading almost hundreds of books on the late Ottoman history, which is questioning so many different things, but you wait for some sort of a creative scholar who will come and change the paradigm to make sense of all of this new scholarship on later Ottoman history. But it's also a book that is almost a guide for activists in today, who are generally very pessimistic, right? The Arab world is dealing with some sort of sectarianism and conflict and collapse of political projects, authoritarianism. And when I visit my colleagues and friends in Arab world or on Turkey, they began to get really hopeless. They say, look, this is not going to change. It's not going to get any better. And there is no, the model that you emulate is European model, democracy. But the Europe is the one is also the acting as an arsonist, right? They are bringing all kind of poisonous ideas. And then Ussama finally kind of relying on all of this recent scholarship, making sense of offering a different reading of that history. And as an Ottomanist, I should say that I try to be a revisionist and progressive Ottoman historian, try to not to narrate the Ottoman past from the Istanbul Turkic perspective. I always make sure that my students can never pass a classroom if they don't know any of the Armenian Ottomans or the Greek Ottoman ministers and pashas. But now after reading this book, and that's one of the reasons why I finished in a single day and got really excited about this, is that I did realize that how much of neglect I still had about the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Because we focus on the North and the Balkans and other places. So I want to kind of go back to focus on 2 important contributions of this book, which is crucial for the kind of a new manifesto, new agenda to teach and write Ottoman history. But I also say that these contributions also is important for the activists. So if we think of Edward Said's Orientalism as a book, not only of historical scholarship, but as a book as a guide for activists. As one of my grad students stated, he read Orientalism as an activist, and he was very surprised that we assigned it in the classroom. I would also say that this book would also serve for the general audience to make things better in the Middle East, because it is finally giving a way out of this kind of hopeless conditions in the Middle East. Let me then highlight 2 crucial scholarly contributions of this book that will also help us politically today. One of them is the narrative on Ottoman history. So this book is changing how we teach, how we do research on the late Ottoman history, especially from 1860s to World War I and beyond. So we do know that just even 100 years ago today, the borders between the north in Turkey and the Ottoman Arab provinces were not hard drawn. There were still imaginations of a Turco-Arab federation. Even in the early French invasion of that area of Syria, for example, Antep was connected to Aleppo still. Adana was connected to Aleppo, and it's a very surprise. I always tell people in Turkey who are helping the Syrian refugees, we have to change the narrative that the Syrian refugees belong to this country, right? 100 years ago today, these borders did not make any sense. They didn't want to be partitioned in some ways. And we have to think about the border between Turkey and the Arab provinces as a kind of partition, as the partition of Palestine or South Asia. So what I learned from this book, and which makes sense with all the other works that we understand, is that the Ottomanism was not a project made in Istanbul and imposed in Arab provinces. Ottomanism was also a vision for a future, a constitutional future based on the rights of different Ottoman citizens, actually produced in Arab provinces, and then spread from there to other places. And there, Ussama Makdisi emphasizes the role of Christian Arabs, also Arab Jews, in producing Ottomanism. And this is the most successful, I think, for most original interpretation of late Ottoman history in recent decades, because we do have a very linear narrative of the late Ottoman Empire. We think that even though Tanzimat of 1839 promise of an inclusive empire, the project failed on many grounds. The project failed because Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslims in Istanbul really weren't interested in sharing power and giving full equality to non-Turkish Sunni elites. But also we know that starting from the Balkans, but going to the Anatolia, minorities who first worked constitutionally to make the empire more inclusive, but at some point they decided that it's better for them to leave. And that's part of the options on the table, that whether you want to reform the empire or you want to leave. And I think what happened in the north from the Balkans to Anatolia, and Ussama doesn't have a nostalgic view of the Ottoman Empire. He knows all the violent conflicts. It ended up leading to World War I and the fracturing of the Ottoman Empire with their decision to preserve the empire. But many of us neglected the Arab provinces. We neglected for various reasons. We thought that they were either part of that kind of a Muslim unity, and Arab Christians were not given a prominent place. What this book shows is that Ottomanism worked out in Arab provinces, especially after the crisis in 1860, the massacres in 1860 in Syria. And we have to restore the position of Ottomanist intellectuals like Georges Aydin, Farah Antoun, Shibli Shumail, and study them next to people like Namık Kemal and Ziya Gökalp. These were also Ottoman intellectuals, and post-partition separation between Turkey and the Arab provinces made sure that none of the Turks today in history textbooks know these names. And even in history departments, they don't study Georges Aydin, they don't study Farah Antoun or Shibli Shumail. And this is the greatest injustice, not only to a fair understanding of history, but also for Turks, for Arabs in some ways. That's not to say to ignore the violence that happened or ethnic cleansing subject to the Armenians. I think Ussama carefully shows that there is a divergence between the northern provinces of the Ottoman Empire and the southern provinces. And in many ways, the Ottoman Empire, that kind of vision of an inclusive Ottoman Empire, survived in the south, which is very important for the kind of post-Ottoman trajectory. So in some ways, through this book, we know that, and I think I have only a couple of minutes left, so you can, Abid, you can warn me. I was gonna go into secularism too, but I will make this connection. Through this book, that we know that there was a vision of a constitutional secular form of state and governance inherited from the late Ottoman Empire, even to the post-Ottoman states of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. And Ussama's book also shows that in some ways we have to think about Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and others are a better inheritor of the good side of Tanzimat than Turkey was, because Republic of Turkey, for various reasons in the north, through the Lausanne Treaty, actually turned Islam into an ethnicity. And in Lausanne Treaty, the borders are drawn to religious lines, and post-Armenian genocide, as well as the Turkish-Greek population exchange, Turkey became a Muslim majority country thanks or because of Ataturk and the Kemalists, right? So the Kemalists actually made Turkey the Islamic majority country that it is. So the diversity was lost, but Osama was showing that actually the southern Arab provinces kept that kind of a constitutional vision of an inclusive state and a secular state going. And he does show how this time the British colonialism or the British French colonialism is the one that actually undermined that inclusive democratic legacy. There is some, I'm going to note briefly, there is this implication for the theory of secularism. This is extremely important aspect of this book because it again goes against the core of the Orientalist argument that the Middle Eastern societies are afflicted with Islamism and religion or any form of religious loyalties. And the secularism comes from Europe. All the good values come from Europe. And somehow they fail to internalize it. And this book shows that no, there was a kind of secularism in this region. And the secularism is ecumenical. You can be a pious Muslim and a Christian, but then have a respect for others. And in fact, it was the European imposed majoritarian nation state projects that destroyed that a Middle Eastern version of secularism. And I will use my last minute for my conclusion. I wrote 2 reviews of this book, so I have many different conclusions, but I will say this book is not only one of the most important books in Middle Eastern history, but also in kind of global history and history of theory of secularism. But I find, I guess my question to Osama in terms of the impact of the book, because it is clear that by rewriting the narrative of the Arab Middle East, not as a land of primordial and innate sectarian passion that led to the failure of ideals of toleration of civic nationalism and democracy, by showing an alternative history, Ussama Makdisi shows that there has been erasures and tragic foreclosures of alternatives to oppressive nationalism today. And by recovering that historical tradition, he's offering a passable, pluralist futures of the region. And that's exactly what we need today in the region from Turkey to Lebanon and everywhere. Thank you. I went beyond a couple of minutes beyond my time.
Thank you. Jamil, we would have loved it if we had all the time in the world for you, because your insights are profound and your reading of the book is very close. I read your book review of it. It's fantastic. I would encourage everybody to check out Jamil's book review. Maybe you can post the link, Jamil?
Yes, yes, of course, yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe I post the PDF, yeah. So
now we are honored to move on to Professor Amal Ghazal. Professor Ghazal is an old friend. She is the Dean of Social Sciences and Humanities and the Dean of the Social Sciences and Humanities at the Doha Institute and the former director of the Center for Comparative Study of Muslim Societies and Cultures at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Professor Ghazal is both the person who I've known longest on this panel, but also the person whose work is probably closest to mine in the sense that she wrote a fantastic book on Oman and the Indian Ocean. She wrote a book called Islamic Reform and Arab Nationalism, expanding the crescent from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, 1880s to 1930s. She's also the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Contemporary Middle Eastern and North African History with Jens Hansen, who I believe is in the audience with us today as well. Professor Ghazal is also a scholar of the Blad al-Sham and besides working on transnational connections in the Indian Ocean and North Africa. So a fantastic scholar and a truly wide-ranging one, and it is my honor to welcome her today.
Thank you so much, Abdel Razzaq. You know, when you give such a generous introduction, don't say we're close friends, okay? Thanks for the invitation, and it's really an honor to take part in this event and to join all those colleagues and friends, especially in North America. You know, being here in Doha and then seeing all of you on my screen, just, you know, it feels great. I feel like I'm still connected. And thanks again, Abdel Razzaq, for giving me the opportunity to read the book thoroughly. Of course, I had looked at it in different contexts for different purposes. This was my chance to read it page by page. And I've noticed that both my colleagues, Judith and Jamil, started their comments by commenting on the connections between the book and issues in the North American context, which I don't have in my introduction. And perhaps this is due to my new positionality, being outside of North America at an institution in the Arab world that seeks to produce knowledge kind of in a certain organic way related to the region and its needs. And thus my introduction misses this comparison between the context, the regional context of the book and the North American context. And I want to start by with the opening line in Ussama's book. Every history of sectarianism is a history of coexistence. I think this captures the essential paradigm of our understanding and our analysis of Ottoman history, late Ottoman history more specifically, and that of the modern Middle East. I mean, as historians, we've been trying to understand the different layers of coexistence in this region, whether in the Ottoman period or in the post-Ottoman one. The sectarian lens deployed by Ussama is fundamental to our analysis because of the multiple ways it challenges dominant historical narratives and provides us with new ones. But it's sectarian within the ecumenical frame that Ussama presents here, not only as a conceptual framework, but also as a reference point through which Ussama was able to bridge the Ottoman with the post-Ottoman and cross-reference the meanings and different manifestations of communalism, nationalism, secularism, anti-sectarianism, and authoritarianism. This late Ottoman history Arab ecumenical frame serves as a comparative point for another one, which is the Islamic one that also emerged at the same time, and both Jamil and I have dealt with this issue as well. While both have commonalities, Ussama's analysis of the Ottoman ecumenical frame from the perspective of sectarian dynamics shows in what ways the two diverged, especially on sectarian issues. Now, I won't be here, I won't be reviewing the book per se and all what it offers in terms of a new theoretical ground and multiple contributions to understanding the intellectual and political history of the modern Middle East. I'd rather focus on some key contributions, or at least contributions I find them key, especially in the ways they relate to work I've been doing. And I've also found them contributions that disrupt and challenge the historiography and provides us with new insights and food for thought. First, the book, and to challenge the primordial characterization of sectarianism in the Middle East and its violent, authoritarian, and anti-democratic aspects, positions 1860 not as a manifestation of a long history of sectarian tensions in the region, especially as Orientalist depictions of our history show, but as a catalyst in the formation of an ecumenical frame that attempted to change the rules of coexistence and make them more secular and more democratic in the broad sense. This by itself is a challenging perspective, challenging in a way that it's a new perspective that we have to take very seriously in the way it positions us to understanding the rest of the historical narrative, or being the point of departure for the historical narrative emerging in this book. Second, it's this point that I have raised just a minute before on the fundamental differences between the Ottoman/Arab and the Islamic ecumenical frames that I want to focus. Ussama's analysis of Muslim reformers is a good reminder of the limits of Islamic reform as it emerged in the late Ottoman period onwards. The celebratory tone with which historians treat the Islamic reform movement, especially of Abdu and Rida, should also be a very cautionary one. Islamic reform's anti-sectarianism was confined within the boundaries of Islam in the form of madhahib and tawa'if, etc. and did not encompass all sects within either the Ottoman frame or the Arab one. Thus, despite the many intersecting layers historians have found between Islamic reform, Ottoman reform, and Arabism, we need to acknowledge the shortcomings of Islamic reform in the context of the Nahda, in relationship to it or in tandem with it. As Ussama indicates, the sting was in the tail. Muslim reformers didn't mind a pluralist nation and a constitutional equality as long as the essential sovereignty, as Ussama shows, derived from Islam. Like Ottoman reformers believed, all is possible as long as Islam remains symbolically and constitutionally ascendant. Thus, the sectarian analytical framework here puts Islamic reform under scrutiny. The same can be said about its relationship with the Nahda. It shared both its chauvinistic and elitist characteristics, but remained ambivalent and was sometimes openly hostile towards what I'm going to call, in very generic terms, liberal values embedded in that Nahda. Like Ussama, I've also been critical of the liberalism associated with the Nahda and Ussama's analysis of the limits of anti-sectarianism among Muslim reformers who are also associated with the Nahda, at least in the literature. I think that serves to validate our criticism of the liberal age. Another point I want to highlight is the importance of the ecumenical frame developed by Ussama in narrating a post-Ottoman history in relationship to an Ottoman one. The historiography of the modern Middle East still tends to write disjointed histories of the Ottoman and the post-Ottoman periods, and to isolate the two from each other. The ecumenical framework as a point of analysis and a point of reference allows for these connections to be established, analyzed, scrutinized, as well as for the transition from the Ottoman to the post-Ottoman to be better understood as one of continuity, though subject to major transformations. This allows us to provide a deeper historical context for sectarianism in the modern Middle East, while understanding the shifts within that context, shifts determined by the dynamics of colonialism, authoritarianism, nationalism, and certain dominant religious discourses. The book also positions Christian Arabs at the center of the analysis and make them not so much collectively, but more as a group of various intellectuals and writers, and throughout a century as the focal lens through which sectarianism, anti-sectarianism, and secularism intersected in the Middle East, and how they played out within the larger context determined by the dynamics of imperialism, majority, minority, nationalism, and anti-colonialism. Much, but not yet enough, has been written about non-Muslim communities in the Middle East, but they're often a story on the side or a case study, and less so the center of a historical narrative that pulls the Ottoman, the post-Ottoman, the Muslim, and the non-Muslim together, and define elements of a broad ecumenical frame. Of course, I should mention the way also Ussama brings Zionism and the colonization of Palestine into historical narrative of sectarianism, also bridging the Ottoman, the post-Ottoman, but I'm sure Ilan Pappé will have a lot to say about this, and I leave that part for him. Ussama was very careful at the beginning of the book about the scope of this analysis. It's a history of sectarianism that positions Muslims vis-a-vis non-Muslims and non-Muslims vis-a-vis Muslims, but not one that positions Muslims vis-a-vis other Muslims when we talk about sectarianism in the Middle East or in the Arab world. It's a sectarianism where the majority-minority relationships are intra-religious, not interreligious. It's also a Mashriq-based analysis, with Mount Lebanon in particular being the nexus of this analysis while drawing on other cases. And Ussama from the very beginning outlines and admits that. Sectarianism in its multiple dimensions and with all its associated elements and manifestations looks different from a geographically broader perspective. the ecumenical frame deployed here applies well to the Mashriq, but may fall short accommodating all categories of sectarianism outside of its Ottoman conditions and Mount Lebanon's specific dynamics. And again, as Ussama says at the very beginning, you know, if we're talking about sectarianism without North Africa and without, let's say, the Arabian Peninsula, we're back to characterizing Arab history as a Mashriqi history. So the story as it unravels in this book is very much a Mashriqi history. That doesn't diminish anything in how, you know, in the contributions it offers, in the way I and my colleagues describe the book as a fundamental one, and we'll see kind of, you know, in what ways it will be shaping historical narratives in the region. But I also want to caution that the contours remain very much Mashriqi ones. I have some kind of a question to Ussama. You know, there is something really nice about the book is the tone, despite everything, is celebratory in the way that the ecumenical frame you create and you use as your analytical paradigm, it kind of gives hope, or at least gives us a well-connected story that keeps us thinking in a very promising way about the region. But you also, don't you think the structural defaults and haphazard mannerism within this frame kept weighing heavily on it until it was perhaps shaken to the core? You seem to see the Arab uprisings as part of this historical chain of events that's grounded in promises of emancipation. And this is why I think the frame you create is very interesting and I think very valid in creating continuity from the late 19th century until the present. But can we maybe see in the Arab uprisings and all the forces related to them, elements denouncing those defaults, revolting against them? In a sense, to what extent can we keep the problematic structural foundations of this ecumenical frame that you outline really well in the introduction on the margin of our historical narrative and on the margin of the realities the region faces today? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amal, for these thoughtful comments, questions, and reflections. Next, we're going to move on to Professor Ilan Pappé. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ilan, who's one of my inspirations in both history and in life. He's a fantastic, of course, historian of Palestine who's written extensively on that subject. His latest books include The Biggest Prison on Earth, The History of the Occupied Territories, for example, which appeared in 2007. But he's written also countless books, most famous being The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. So clearly, Professor Pappé is an expert on Zionism, but what many people do not know is that he's also done extensive work on Ottoman history. I'm thinking here of the wonderful book he wrote on the Husseini family of Jerusalem. He's also started his career as an expert on British colonialism in the region and as it intersected with Zionism, with his book Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1948 to 1951. Professor Pappé is often associated with the New Historians group, but I shall say that he is the best by far out of all of them. Many of them carry the marks of Israeli colonialism. He is the only one out of the entire group that has actually decolonized himself and his work. So this is why we love him, and this is why it is such a great honor to be hosting him today. Please go ahead, Ilan.
Thank you so much, Abed. It was such an introduction, and I'm hesitating whether I should continue. But thank you so much. You're always very welcoming, and and complimentary. And thank you so much. It's really encouraging. Thank you. And thank you both to you and Ussama and the center for inviting me with such an incredible line of panelists. And it is my great pleasure and honor to take part in this celebration of a truly significant scholarly contribution to our understanding of the past and present realities of the Middle East and the Mashreq, the Eastern Middle East in particular. This is a fascinating book that is a healthy, powerful antidote, or using a more topical language, a double vaccination against the continued insidious and at times poisonous American mainstream media analysis of the Arab world, despite the incredible wisdom and intellectual effort of many American scholars working on the region, which unfortunately are not heard in the official voice of America for years now. Reading the book, I imagined a constant dialogue and exchange of view with my late supervisor in Oxford, Albert Hourani, who was, apart from being a supervisor, was a mentor, and for someone who lost his father at the age of 12, was also a parent and a guardian. The book corresponds in a critical way, but a very friendly way, with Albert's sanguine reconstruction of what he called the moment of grace in the Mashreq between the 1860s and the 1930s. A historical moment when, in his view, in Albert Hourani's view, West and East interacted in a way that enabled what he called internal dynamics of modernization to move forward. Albert was a Western modernization,ist, there's no denying, but he differed from others who wrote about the so-called modern Middle East, as he believed it was only possible to Westernize a society if it would not destroy or deny what the past had to offer.
Ilan, we need you to raise your volume or to speak close.
Okay, I will do that. Good. Shall I start from the beginning, or you?
I think people have heard you up till the Hourani bit. Your exchanges with.
Okay, I'll start with the Hourani bit. How is my voice now? Is it better?
Much better.
Much better. And I do apologize. We all seem to have. Each one of us has his technical issues. Sorry about that. Okay, reading the book, I will go back to Hourani. I imagine the constant dialogue and exchange of views with my late supervisor in Oxford, Albert Hourani, who was a mentor, and for someone who lost his father at the age of 12, also a parent and a guardian. The book corresponds in a critical way with Albert's sanguine reconstruction of what he called the moment of grace in the history of the Mashreq between the 1860s and the 1930s, a historical moment when, in Albert's view, the West and the East interacted in a way that enabled what he called internal dynamics of modernization to move the society forward. He was a Western modernization,ist, Albert, and there is no denying about that. But he differed from others who wrote on the so-called modern Middle East, as he believed it was only possible to modernize a society if it would not destroy or deny what the past had to offer. No wonder that his hero was Muhammad Abduh, and anyone else who was able to articulate a modernized tradition or a traditional modernity. Others called this period the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance. Zaidan, one of Ussama's protagonists, talked about an age of Arab literature and culture in the shadow of a Western civilization, a renaissance of Arab thought that shook the Arabs out of the torpor of stagnation and backwardness in adverted commas. Ussama's book sheds a new light of this moment in the region's history. The grace, so to speak, was not infusing West and East, but was actually a less romanticized form of human behavior, a pragmatic, intelligent local coexistence that the West, rather than interacting with, in many ways destroyed. The book tells us how this human tapestry, especially in the Mashreq, of communal coexistence was sustained by dynamic enacting and interacting of individual and collective identities. As Ussama rightly points out, religion was the core signifier and basis for these collective identities. But these were not rigid definitions. Only rarely religious differences led to extreme violent interactions. Most of the time, alienation, and there was alienation, was mitigated by the common ecological and social realities which were common to all, whether these were the moments of joy or sadness in the village, relationship with the landowners, tax collectors, and foreigners, or in the city, encountering a new affluence on the one hand, and the appearance of the first time of refugees from the impoverished countryside on the other. Like Albert Khurani, our dear friend Ussama is engaged in social history of ideas. As he rightly says, it is the foremost a story of one particular group, which Ussama called the literate Arab Ottoman, and Albert called the Arab intellectuals. But this group reflects the reality of other social groups, since it was a reflective articulation of these realities. We do not have films, documentaries, participant observers reports helping us to appreciate the dynamics of group and individual identities from that period. Through these treasured works that Ussama has worked on from the past, we can assume how individual and collective identities are enacted and performed, including the ability to move between spaces of identity and into which you could enter and exit, not routinely, although in hindsight it might seem so, and what we realize retrospectively, and this book does it very well, became a way of life. Experts, pundits, politicians, and media in the West frame this imperfect coexistence as sectarianism. This is a book that challenges this framing and offers a much better coining, the ecumenical frame. It also, in a way, laments, although not in a too romanticized way, the disappearance of this flawed harmony and way of life. I share this year, and in particular can connect to its moment and method of destruction in Palestine by Zionism. The way it was manipulated to violent aggravation in Lebanon by imperialist intervention and eventually led to the disaster which is Syria today. A way of life where not every difference needed to be outspoken, and not every alienation or religious disdain had to be articulated, stressed, and insisted upon. Dialogue became a way of life, not means to solve a problem. Edward Said warned us about this insistence on purification within this human tapestry of communities, coexistence in the sense of living one next to another, intertwined into each other, at times secluding from each other, but always sustaining this fragile human mosaic until it was disrupted and torn by outside intervention, be it colonialism, imperialism, Zionism, as well as good intentional liberalism and socialism, each with its own version of divide and rule politics, accompanied by neoliberal practices, ethnic purification, and encouraging religious fanaticism. Palestine for me is always a case in point. And I can chart in my imagination and reconstruct as a scholar the ecumenical frame before 1948, when many of the Palestinian villages were mixed and holy sites would be celebrated by all three religions. When the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was in its midst, some of the villagers, even at that catastrophic moment in their lives, were trying to preserve the ecumenical frame. Druze in the Galilee refused to remain alone in villages where they lived for centuries with Muslims and Christians, and insisted that if their Muslim neighbors would be expelled, they would go with them. It did not always happen, but it should be recorded where it did take place, in villages such as Yarka, Mrar, and Khorfesh. Not much of that is there today. In these villages, most people unfortunately voted in the last 4 elections for Benjamin Netanyahu. And yet there are Druze and Muslim families, the Muslim families are internal refugees from nearby destroyed villages of the Nakba, that in a brave and almost impossible way maintain that past legacy. One example are young Druze who refused to serve in the Israeli army, part of a youth movement called Urfud, refuse, and other Druze individuals who had been involved in years now in the Palestinian liberation movement. While the ecumenical frame was functioning, relationship between individuals and communities were charted according to an unwritten code of law. Ussama calls it unstated consensus, haphazard, not methodical, but yet with its own inner logic and constant adaptation to the realities of life. When I wrote my book on the Hosseini family, which Abed so kindly mentioned, and its 200 years of history since 1700, I also was impressed by the haphazardness that is constantly unstated and yet is very visible in every aspect of life. How this was disrupted can be best understood if we go back to Palestine and focus for a short moment on the way colonialism and Zionism changed its land regime and communal customs of sharing and solidarity. Until the First World War, landowners in Palestine, even if they were absentee landowners from Beirut, or before that Ottoman state officials, they never assumed that they had the right to dispossess the tenants. These were not European entitlements of ownership, but they were as solid, if not more than, the property laws of the West. It all dramatically changed with the arrival of the settler colonial movement of Zionism, that with the help of the British mandatory authorities, totally ignored this custom and ownership in Palestine. Every piece of land it bought, the Zionist movement bought, led to the eviction of the tenants. Similarly, the unwritten code that allowed bypassers to quench their thirst and satisfy their hunger from whatever the wells, fields, and orchards offered was alien to the East European Jewish settlers and the Beckers in Britain, organized in the Jewish National Fund. When the Zionist settlers arrived, they insisted that such commonality is theft and robbery, usually on land from which the original tenants were forcefully removed. But the frame is not totally lost, and here and there you can note its existence. I mentioned the Urfut movement in the Upper Galilee, and could add to this the Palestinian women and men, especially in this time of year, for those of you who are familiar with the ecological cycle of Palestine's wild herbal vegetation. They defy the Israeli law that allegedly meant to protect the environment, but in practice aims to destroy the Palestinian way of living. They do it by collecting the za'atar, arkub, and the hubeza, and here and there picking up an apple or an orange from a kibbutz and moshav's orchard built on the ruins of their villages on the way to work or home. The ecumenical frame or tapestry in the city created this fusion of religiously defined quarters in Safad, Tiberias, Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem on the one hand, but also the intellectual activism that produced the Nadi al-Arabi in Jerusalem in the face of a more hostile new regime in Istanbul in 1909, and more importantly, the Muslim Christian Association in the face of the Balfour Declaration. It was a natural response because the Muslim elite sent their children to Christian schools, and the Muslim Christians, and even for a while Jewish graduates of the Muslim and Christian schools, initiated the human and intellectual workshop in which modernity, tradition, and everything between them was discussed and translated into school curricula, political programs, cultural productions of plays, poems, and books. It is telling that one of the first acts of the British rulers in Palestine was to create a supreme Muslim council as means of dividing the Christians from the Muslims, which in turn did not work as the council, the Majlis, became a power base for the first Palestinian National Party run by Christians and Muslims. Similarly, the first act of the State of Israel was to try and create an Arab Druze and an Arab Christian non-Palestinian identities for the Palestinian minority, which failed in the case of the Christians and only partly succeeded in the case of the Druze. When we remind ourselves not to idealize these relationships, we refer to Ussama's comment of the difference between a declared equivocation from above, pushed forward by the Ottomans in order to satisfy Europe on the one hand, and the continued primacy of Muslims in this human tapestry on the other. I think this is what we mean by not romanticizing it, but also by not vilifying it. It had rare, extreme, and ugly manifestation of violence, as Ussama noted, as part of an attempt to maintain the status quo, salutary actions in essence, but not genocidal or eliminatory. The eliminatory side of the Ottoman policies toward the Armenians in particular mainly were not the outcome of the way the tapestry functioned or the ecumenical frame functioned, but rather a symptom of its disappearance. State anti-sectarianism and anti-state sectarianism were born with the incorporation of the Mashriq and Anatolia into the European games of power. Identities negotiated through longer periods of experience, intimacy, and existence were substituted with a dramatic demand for pure cohesive identities. Throw to the mix modern weaponry, and you can see how the collapse of the ecumenical frame imploded and swallowed and dehumanized large communities identified by their religion, be they Christian, Muslim, Jews, Armenians, Assyrians, or Kurds. So finally, and with this I will end, what is left today of the ecumenical frame? Personally, I still believe it is there. I feel it through my involvement in grassroots Palestinian activism and even sensed its existence in the past when I was, for a very short while, involved in Palestinian politics from above. It is this coexistence which respects the historical and cultural embrace of Islam as civilization and the home of the Arabic language, something I felt even when I was part of the Palestinian Communist Party. Sometimes it comes as nostalgia for a bygone past, but recently and more often as an inspiration for a different future of a new Nahda, informed by history, but also by a vibrant agenda of a new generation. In essence, it is a non-Western, definitely non-American, way forward with dealing with a very difficult moment in the history of the Mashriq. If we will succumb to the continued effort to cover us by the imposed and false blanket of sectarianism and allow it to substitute the tapestry in which we have a space to coexist, the legacy of the ecumenical frame would be lost. But if we resist, the frame, or at least its legacy, will enable us to build networks locally and globally to push forward the struggle for justice and liberation. If this will happen, Albert's moment of grace will return, a different and updated Nahda will be possible, and Ussama will be able to write a second, sanguine volume that would follow this wonderful book of his. Hopefully, this time, we will be invited in person to Houston itself to comment on the second volume. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilan. And now we're going to move on to the great author himself. Ussama, of course, is the Arab American Educational Foundation chair in Arab Studies at Rice University. He's the inaugural holder of that position. He is also a professor of history at Rice University and the author of multiple influential books on the region. His first book was Culture of Sectarianism, which was a fantastic contribution to the history of the region that contested primordialist approaches to sectarianism. Incidentally, I first read it in James Riley's seminar, and James is here with us today in the audience, I think. And his second book, Artillery of Heaven, was also a serious examination of the Arab Nahda, but also as it encountered American missionaries, and it's a very thorough reflection on colonialism as well as intellectual histories in the region. The third book that he wrote took the subject of American foreign policy even further, and it probed into how the relations between the Arabs and the United States changed from early encounters with missionaries to the war and destruction that we see amongst us today. And now his crowning achievement is this fourth book that we're discussing today. So this is an incredibly rich scholarly portfolio that we have. I should note that Ussama is probably the only historian I know in Middle East studies, at least, probably in the historical profession, that has written 3 articles for the American Historical Review, that is published in every major journal you can imagine. So a very distinguished person with us today, and we're honored to introduce him. Please go ahead, Ussama.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Ahmed? Yeah. Thank you so much, Abed, Professor Takriti. Thank you to the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston. Thank you to Fadi Kafaiti as well for facilitating this project. And of course, thank you to the 4 presenters or commentators, Professor Tucker, Professor Ghazal, Professor Ilan, and Professor Pappé, for these incredibly generous comments. Actually, honestly, I'm embarrassed. I typically don't know, you know, I'm not used to having this kind of book forum. But I really appreciate the readings, and I appreciate, you know, all of us write to have people read what we write, and we can no longer take that for granted. So I appreciate that at least 5 people here have read this book. I can assume that 5 at least have read this book. So I really appreciate that. And I'd like to start by I mean, I'll get to some of the points that were raised. Abed, you want me to speak for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just max, just a few?
You can speak as much as you want, Habibi.
No, I don't want to just go on. I just want to say.
Let's. The more you speak, the less time we have for the audience. But also, we want you to speak because.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's. I mean, I've said what I have to say in the book, honestly. But in terms of the, let me just say a few things in response to some of the points that have been raised. I mean, I agree with virtually. I mean, Judith offered at the beginning some very potent criticisms of the book and of my I guess avenues and areas that could be explored more fully, and I agree with her totally. I'll come back to these points. Jamil's point as well about Jamil was like incredibly over generous with the comparison to Edwards Orientalism. Thank you for that. Of course, I appreciate that. Although I don't accept it, but I appreciate it. And Amal's sort of, you know, brilliant point about the absence of the you know, the fact that the Mashriq is at the heart of this book, which of course is true, and she asks correctly about what would this look like from the perspective or the vantage point of other parts of the region and frankly other parts of the world. I mean, whether we're talking about the Gulf or whether we're talking about North Africa, whether we're talking about the Indian Ocean, or any of these parts, and these are all, you know, fair criticisms. And Ilan's reminder to us, of course, of the foundational work of Albert Hourani, and I think Ilan is absolutely correct to note that this book was written in part in dialogue with you know, in sort of dialogue with Hourani's work, because of course the point about Hourani, for me at least, the way I read Albert Hourani's work and the way I feel like all 4 commentators today, I think we're all on the same page. We all sort of want to write histories of this region that not only push back against the sort of the absurd Orientalism and the racism and the sectarianism of the historiography that has been so overwhelmingly and oftentimes egregiously inhumane and ungenerous vis-a-vis the Arab world, the Middle East, Turkey, the Muslim world, and so on and so forth. But also that all of us, I think, I assume, let me speak for myself, I wanted to push back against what I feel today, especially, is both this extraordinary sense of defeat, especially in the Arab world, where people have just, in a sense, they've lost sight of the history, the history of our region on the one hand, and they also know very little, frankly. And I'm not judging people, but I really do believe this. They know so little about the history of the West, of the United States, of Europe, of the extraordinary racism, and of racial histories and of exclusions that continue, of course, to manifest in very obvious ways across this country, and of course in Europe itself. And so my idea was to write a history that allows us, as people from the region, or people who are concerned with the region. It's not just a nativist book. It's not even principally or at all a nativist book. It's meant to be a book which engages with the region in empathetic terms. And the idea is to allow us a conceptual vocabulary to think through some of the problems of how to transition, or how we have transitioned from overt systems of discrimination and superiority in the Ottoman case, the Ottoman Islamic case, towards systems of equality, or at least gestures of equality or programs of equality and citizenship, and to see how contested these were, not just in the Ottoman Empire and in the post-Ottoman Arab East, but frankly everywhere in the world. And once we put this framework that there was an extraordinary history on the ground, what I call what the ecumenical frame, and it has complications. And it was, and this goes to Judith's point. My point was not that women are not are passive. Of course not. They're very. I mean, that goes without saying. It's that, or nor that women's movements were passive. It's that there was a fundamentally, alas, a fundamentally, what I say in the book is that there was a fundamentally conservative consensus that emerges in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that persists until today. And that consensus is summarized, if we have to summarize it, in one basic dichotomy, which is secular citizenship, initially, of course, male citizenship, juxtaposed with religiously informed and segregated laws of personal status. And that's the basic juxtaposition that enabled the ecumenical frame to flourish. I, of course, I'm not saying that's the only form by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, there were incredibly radical forms of the ecumenical frame, radical forms of coexistence. And so what I was trying to do in the book as well is to rehabilitate a term that has been so maligned in recent historiography, coexistence, and to rehabilitate it, but to do it on terms that I feel are more historical, so that we can go back to our past and examine and explore with empathy, without apology, the past in all its complexity, whether it's negative or positive, but not to sit there and think that there's just some kind of ideal out there that is better than us or that is superior to us. And that's really what I'm pushing back against the most. Now, in terms of very specifically to answer, then I'll stop the points that were raised. Judith's really fantastic criticisms. I agree, as I said, with almost everything Judith said, but I remind all the listeners today that anti-sectarianism is not the same thing as secularism. And that's one of the points I'm trying to emphasize in the book, that anti-sectarianism there's a large gamut of anti-sectarian movements and sentiments and solidarities, some of which are in fact incredibly pious, religious, and others which are far more secular. And there's a whole range in between. And so the point is that what I was asking is, why is it, or isn't it interesting that women's movements in the Arab world, to the best of my knowledge, and of course here I am not an expert on any of these things, and I'm sort of an interloper on so much of this history, and so I'm happy to be corrected, and I'm happy for others, of course, to do this exploration in more detail. And I know one of my students is doing this kind of work. Is this question of, did women's movements in the Arab East or in Turkey, but especially in the Arab East, where there wasn't an overtly or aggressively secular state in place, did they push for secular personal or uniform civil codes, or did they not? And if not, does that actually stop the ecumenical sort of impetus? Of course not. Does it stop coexistence? Of course not. But there is an interesting sort of question that arose for me in this. So I'm completely for more research, not less. Was personal status, the segregated forms of personal status that persist until today, were these, Judith asks, a necessary evil? No, of course not. But they were a historical product of a particular era, of a moment, which still, of course, shadows us or dogs us. And so it was a conservative interpretation that, of course, women throughout the region of all faiths have fought against. And I don't need to tell Judith this. Judith has led in terms of the work on this. And so it's absolutely, more work needs to be done on all these things, but without, again, and there is, of course, excellent work being done without somehow, again, what I really want to emphasize, without falling back on this idea that somehow there's a better place out there, because the issue is not better or worse. The issue is, this is our historical experience. Let's actually analyze it on its own terms, rather than constantly import the latest Western sort of academic categories and then, plug them in the Middle East. So, and that's really another thing I was doing. So on Jamil's points, I guess, Jamil, I agree with everything you said. And one of the paradoxes that I've been struggling with is the whole idea of the Nahda occurring in an age of genocide or extreme nationalism. So this bifurcation of the Ottoman Empire between North and South. And it's one of the ironies of the book, and the sad ironies of the book, is that the two strongest sovereignties that emerge in the region are Kemalist Turkey on the one hand and the Zionist state of Israel on the other. And both of these, in very different ways, because of course one is a settler colonial state and the other is not, but both engage in a war against pluralism for very different reasons. And the irony is that the Arab states of the mandate are all sort of far weaker states, far weaker sovereignties, and yet they tend not to go to war against pluralism, at least not initially. And so that was another one of the juxtapositions, and that's why I wanted to compare Lebanon with Iraq, as opposed to Lebanon with Israel, which is what the standard comparison is. In terms of Amal's point, I agree with Amal. This is a Mashriqi-centered, I mean, I say it, of course, in the beginning of the book, it is a Mashriqi-centered history. But the question, of course, is, and I asked Amal this, because she's far more of an expert than me on this, what would this, first of all, does this make sense? Can we apply this kind of thesis to the Indian Ocean, to the Gulf region, to North Africa, where there's no significant indigenous or major Christian indigenous presence? There's a Jewish presence, of course. There are different kinds there are different kinds of ethnicities. What happens in different locations? So I didn't want to take, and that's why I was very clear, I don't want to say the Mashriq is the be all and end all of everything and go back to the old history of the Nahda, which says that this is the location. But in terms of ecumenism, and specifically Muslim, Christian, Jewish coexistence, I don't know any other part of the world which had as much writing on that as the Mashriq, honestly. And I think that's one of the reasons why I focus on the Mashriq. So there's a reason why I do focus, but I really wanted to see what happens when, I don't know everything, obviously, and I know I'm, part of what I always tell my students and tell myself is that, there's so much that we don't know in this history. There's so much of this history we haven't read, so many sources we haven't really given the time of day to. And they're all over the place. And we keep pretending that the only archive is the state archive. Well, there are other archives, and we know that there are other archives. So let's examine those other archives. And Abed, of course, has done a huge amount of work on uncovering many of these archives. And then as far as the last point that Ilan raises, I agree. I think the point that Ilan, I think, got is that I'm trying to argue for coexistence as a culture, as a way of life, and the difference between coexistence after the 19th century and coexistence before the 19th century, that there is a vast sort of difference once we get the question of secular equality in play, because that's where the whole idea of sectarianism, the notion of sectarianism, the modern notion of ta'ifiyya, or the notion of coexistence, and Aish al-Mushtarak, or all these terms emerge in the mid-19th century. And that's why I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there's an extraordinary history of coexistence in the Middle East. And people, I'll end here just with this last point about, people often talk about Andalusia, and I'm always intrigued by Andalusia, because they say this great history of coexistence, but and that's an important history. But then I think of Damascus, and I think of Damascus, and I think of Aleppo, and I think of all these other cities, Jerusalem, these cities which have had a far greater stretch of unbroken coexistence. We never talk about these things, and if we do talk about them, they mock us and they say, well, we shouldn't talk about these, you're romanticizing. And so I just want people should historicize constantly, and just stop with the constant self-deprecation and self-loathing, and start with the honest, complex excavation of the past, because the past, as the past is so fundamental to our understanding of who we are and where we're going. So thank you very much to each of you for your comments, and thank you so much, Abed and Fadi and everyone else for all the help. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ussama. Now we're going to move on to the question and answer session, which will be moderated by Fadi Qafaiti, the Assistant Director of the Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston. Fadi, of course, is doing a PhD with me on South Yemen, and he came here after training with Professor Beth Barron at the CUNY Graduate Center. So he's doing wonderful work, and he's going to be moderating this session. I should note, Ussama, that Professor Tucker wrote a comment mentioning that these were not criticisms per se, they were invitations for future research. So I just wanted to note that. But please go ahead, Fadi. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. So we have a first question in the chat. Again, you're more than welcome to either type a question or raise your hand through the Zoom function, and then I'll unmute you in due course. Our first question is by Firat for, I believe, Dr. Amal. Thank you very much for following up on the cautionary notes on the Mashriq-centeredness of the ecumenical frame. I wonder how the age of coexistence would look like from the vantage point of the Indian Ocean instead of, and in brackets or in addition to, the Mediterranean. And they wish you greetings from Doha. With that, I will unmute you. And then the second question is posed by MM to Dr. Jamil Aydin. I think, is it possible to elaborate on how can the book contribute to healing a mutual struggle for and with Syrians today, such that we acknowledge the disaster in what quote happened in Syria in a way that meaningfully dignifies and connects with the ongoing revolutionary agency of Syrians. And then the third comment will be to Dr. Makdisi, which could that be read, the ecumenical frame? I'm very interested in the interlinked nature of the ecumenical frame and Arabness as a secular vessel of this frame. Could that be read as the most rigid border of the ecumenical frame? And looking forward, do you believe it is still possible to salvage that Arabness from its tightening ethno-linguistic brackets and increasingly even religious borders? Or do we, as Syrians, Iraqis, etc., have to contend with a smaller identification, but perhaps a more inclusive one, and without the baggage of Arab nationalist, Ba'athist violence and trauma?
Thanks, Fadi. And sorry, I missed the name of the person who asked the question. Thanks for this question. It's interesting because as I was writing my comment to Ussama on this particular issue, I was thinking about my work on North Africa and sectarianism in the sense of what was going on between Malikis and Ibadis. So I'm looking at the intra-religious dynamics, and then I get the question on the Indian Ocean, and I need to make this mental shift to Zanzibar, because those who are familiar with my work on the Indian Ocean, it is situated in Zanzibar more specifically. And I would actually use the same kind of frame that Ussama uses, that there was something ecumenical, something very similar, in a sense that if we look at, the Swahili frame, and if we look at the religious dynamics under Omani rule in Zanzibar, we see something similar in the way, we celebrated in a book like the Age of Coexistence, in the way, let's say, Ibadis, Sunnis, different ethnicities, non-Muslims were interacting with each other. And there is this also lens on these issues that comes from, one that tends also to be anti-sectarian. So there are many similarities, but I think what's missing here is the different connections, intellectual richness of debating these issues before the 20th century. So I think first, what's missing with the Ottoman context, you know what I mean? Like the different communities engaging in modern means of communication, in discussing identities, in discussing relationships between the different communities. So we lack the sources we have in the context of Zanzibar that we have in the Ottoman context, although we have the same frame. The end is similar and different at the same way. I mean, the end of the ecumenical frame is really 1964 in Zanzibar, and the revolution that took place. And that, shattered also coexistence as we knew it from the kind of mid-19th century onwards. But like Ussama's work, that's due to the structural problems inherited in this ecumenical framework. The Arab superiority in the Indian Ocean in the context of Zanzibar, the certain dynamics between Ibadi and Sunni Islam, the whole slavery issue. That's part of this ecumenical framework, but not, discussed enough up until later in the period under scrutiny. I mean, I can go on and on, but I think there are similarities and there are, some disconnections in the stories.
Just to briefly, I will say that Ussama Makdisi's framework could also be applied to South Asia, and in fact, it is happening in India. The Muslim minority in India had to struggle for their rights by rewriting history, and we have a very good scholar named Audrey Trochka at Rutgers University, who has been attacked by Hindu fundamentalism precisely because she's writing a history of almost a very similar history of the ecumenical frame and coexistence in South Asia, that denies this idea that Hindu India is dominated by this fanatic Muslim rulers. And she's offering an alternative, which is then offering some sort of hope for minorities in post-partition South Asia. And I think with the question about Syrians in Turkey, or in general about the kind of political inspiration that this book can give us, is that there is a certain sense of pessimism about the future. I think we lost the future, and by actually showing in some sort of lost future of today in the Ottoman past, it could have been, what else could have happened? We could actually learn lessons. Although we cannot go back into history, we can learn lessons to build alliances, solidarities today. I think I found the book very valuable in that regard. And with regard to Syrians in Turkey, I have been observing and reading about this kind of anti-Syrian discrimination in Turkey. And it relies on this idea that you don't belong to this country, you didn't fight for the Ottoman Turkey, you betrayed the Ottoman Empire. The people, the group in Turkey, for example, who don't like the 4 million Syrians, and every single one of them is wrong, right? There were Arabs who fought for the Ottoman army in World War I. From this framework, you consider actually it's the Republic of Turkey that betrayed the Ottoman legacy. Places like Aleppo or Mosul remain as some sort of Ottoman cities until very recently. And this may, if anyone wants to work on this, you can write to me on the kind of Syrians in Turkey and the kind of historical narratives that they can build to empower themselves. They can email me, and I guess I can give some sort of summaries of this book, which can empower those groups. So I find this book's interpretation of history hopeful and empowering for a lot of solidarity movements, but also pro-democracy and good governance movements in the region.
And could I just add a comment on that in terms of the Arabism question? It's a great question, Yazan. In terms of the point, of course, would be to say that Ottomanism, Arabism, and where we are today are all stages or all aspects of the ecumenical frame. I mean, in other words, can we go back to a 1950s understanding of Arabism? No, I don't think about going back, but I think there is something to be said for trying to see what is common in sort of the most anti-sectarian aspects of Ottomanism, the most anti-sectarian aspects of Arabism, and try to sort of build a new sense of where we are without falling back into smaller, because smaller identities doesn't necessarily mean better. You can have a smaller identity that's just as sectarian, that's just as exclusive, that's just as violent. And in fact, the tragedy of Iraq and Syria is that the smaller identities, in fact, often trumped and made hollow the larger ideals about which the states allegedly were supposed to fulfill. And so again, the point is the point for me would be to see where and how we can sort of look in the 1950s and 1940s and 1930s and remember, like so many of my fellow scholars here, there's so much of this history we don't actually know. What we know is what people think they know is what they've experienced in the last 20, 30 years, the devastations in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. And on that basis, people then project backwards and say, it's always been this way, and this has always been false, or Arabism has always been evil, or it's always been fascistic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, without actually doing the work to see, in fact, that there are extraordinarily beautiful and ecumenical aspects that we need to understand if we stand any chance of building a common future, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, however this future is imagined. It's not for me to say what people should do or should say. I'm just not someone who could accept and say that all our history has been sectarianism or it's all been false. This is the most dangerous myth that's propagated today, is the idea that our history is false or a failure. What's failed are political projects. The political projects have failed for all sorts of reasons, including, as Ilan mentioned, as I argue in the book, of course, Western colonialism. That's not to say that the West is responsible for everything, but there's no way to interpret our modern history without acknowledging the extraordinary role that the West has played, but also our own sort of the agency of peoples in the region, whether the Arabs, Turks, Iranians, or others.
So Fadi, are you there?
Yes, I am. So we have a question in the chat from Muhammad. From Said Sultan Al-Hashmi, then Muhammad Khair Nahas, and then we're going to unmute. Somebody just dropped their hand. I'm sorry if I didn't see you. Please raise your hand again.
Professor.
Exactly. So the first question by Said to Dr. Makdisi is, why at the time of the revolution did sectarianism remain silent? Why at this stage sectarianism filled public space with noise and victims? And where do coexistence go at the state stage in the Arab world? Another one to Dr. Makdisi. Thank you for the interesting event. While constructing identities, there was always an other and outside that defined as the negative. How can we in this day and age where migration and globalization have changed societies all over the world develop an inclusive view of citizenship? And then the last question, the person who had their hand raised, could you please raise them again so I can unmute you?
Maurice.
Okay, perfect. You should be able to speak now.
Hi, I'm just wondering, hi everyone. I'm just wondering if perhaps, if maybe Ussama could answer the two questions first, and then we could go to another round of questions. I feel like Ussama in some regards is being bombarded from different directions.
Yeah, I can try to. I mean, the questions are hard questions to answer because, of course, I don't have answers that will satisfy these questions. But if I understand the first question, it's not clear to me. But I think he means why was anti-sectarianism silenced, and why did sectarianism fill the public spaces? I think that's if I understand the question. And
would you like me to unmute Said for you, Dr. Makdisi?
It's up to. I mean, it's up to you. Whatever you guys want to do is
fine.
Said,
let me unmute you. Perhaps you can pose your question in Arabic or. Said, you should be able to speak now.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this very interesting dialogues. Thank you very much. The same which I meant in the questions. Why in the revolution time we don't heard about sectarism, and always we talking about coexistence, but in the state stage all of this disappeared in Arab world.
Okay. Well, I think that what I would say, of course, is that I have to respect and stand in solidarity with the people in Syria, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Lebanon, in Palestine, across this region, in Egypt, in Tunis, everywhere in the Arab world and the region, who have sort of struggled against despotism and against violence and against oppression. Frankly, I mean, that's the point. But I would say, if we just look and analyze, there's a difference between analyzing what's happened in the last 10 years, 12 years. There's no question that there has been, in fact, overwhelming evidence of anti-sectarian solidarities in Egypt, in Tunis, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in all sorts of places. And of course, there's overwhelming evidence of sectarian mobilizations, especially motivated or encouraged by various states in the region that have, and of course by various Western powers. There's been a combination of these sort of factors at play. So there's no, it's not a surprise to me that now at this stage, the anti-sectarian sentiments or the revolutionary sentiments or the liberation sentiments have been smashed, because that is the nature of what we're witnessing. Just like in Palestine, the bid for liberation has been smashed now, right now. I mean, there's right now, in the moment, it is a desperate moment. But there's a difference between saying that and then saying it's always been like this and it always has to be like this. The geopolitical conditions today are overwhelmingly oppressive. There's just no doubt in my mind when I look at the Arab world. And every part of the Arab world, whether it's Sunni or Shia or whatever you want to describe it as, overwhelmingly geopolitical despotism and the crushing of hopes. And so, but that doesn't mean that people don't hope, haven't risen up, because they have. And when they do rise up, what's fascinating is to see again the evidence, the overwhelming evidence of the persistence of this sort of anti-sectarian ecumenism, this humanism that you see throughout this region. And that's really what I'm interested in focusing on. I don't know what the other question was. Honestly, I forgot now. About globalization, you know, honestly, again, it's the same point. It stands everywhere in the world. The idea of secular ecumenical coexistence is a challenge everywhere, in every single part of the world, here in the US, in Europe, in India, since Jamil mentioned India, in different, in East Africa, in West Africa, everywhere, the challenge of coexistence, of secular equality is constantly being undermined. And we see it's never a done thing. It's constantly, you fight for it, and there are setbacks. But the point ultimately is an individual, for me as an individual, it's an ethical question. Where does one stand, and where does one stand vis-a-vis these extraordinary forces of despotism? That's all I can really say at this point.
All right. I think we're, do we have any more questions, Fadi, before I ask mine, and then we end the...
Yes, we do. We actually have one from Dr. Maurice, who I will unmute now, and then I'll read the next one in the chat. Okay, they should be able to speak.
Hi, thank you. I'll be short, I promise, or at least I'll try to promise. Ussama, thank you very much for this wonderful book. I, especially from a position of decolonization, really appreciated the kind of layered politics of privilege that you tackle or try to kind of maneuver through during this kind of historical time when the nation state form in different ways came to serve as kind of an extension of imperial relationships rather than a break, you know, which is mystified by different shades of liberalism and so on. And so my question for you is a question about your decolonial positionality in framing your framework. What were some of the major challenges that you, internal and external challenges that you faced when trying to write or come up with this framework that kind of reifies sectarianism in an anti-sectarian way?
Well, I mean, thank you for that question, Maurice. And I think the answer would be that, first of all, the Arab world is still colonized. I think that is the fundamental point. That's my point of departure. And the work and the destruction. I mean, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was 2003. Palestine is ongoing. The U.S., as you know, over 50% of all weapons, I think, if I'm not mistaken, over 50% of all weapons produced in the U.S. in terms of the military hardware is sent or bought or consumed or used in the Middle East. So it's and then of course you have the Russians and you have Iranians and you have all sorts of Russians. You have all these other external factors as well. So that it's a colonized. We live in a colonized world. So the whole American academic or Western academic theories of decoloniality and are ones that I'd rather focus on the history that we are experiencing now because we're not even anywhere close to the dreams of a decolonial or a decolonial future, to use the language of American and Western academia. But thank you for that question.
So I'll pose the a question that was raised in the chat, then hand it over to Dr. Takriti for his question. This question is coming from, well, I'm not quite sure who it's coming from, but considering the necessary ecumenism between Muslims and non-Muslims, what are we to make of the increasingly dangerous tensions among Muslims? And then in brackets, Sunni versus Shia being the most obvious example. And Dr. Takriti, the floor is yours.
Well, let's get Professor Makdisi to answer this first.
I mean, the obvious answer would be, look, in the 19th century, the question was posed as Muslim and non-Muslim, the Eastern question. And then in the 20th century, it was Arab and Jew. And then during the Lebanese Civil War, it's Muslim and Christian. And now it's Sunni and Shia. So my point is that these things are always being recast. These struggles, these geopolitical struggles are being recast constantly as eternal primordial struggles, when in fact they're so obviously, especially the last 20 years, it's before our eyes. We can see what's happening. And people draw on, those who are ill-willed will draw on aspects of history and narratives to bolster their positions. So that doesn't mean that they're A, correct, or B, faithful to a historical tradition. So that's what I would say.
So I have a final question for both Professor Pappé and Professor Makdisi. The last chapter of the book deals with the question of the pressures that were put on the ecumenical frame. And in particular, I think, Ussama, you integrate the question of Zionism into the equation. Often when people talk about sectarianism or the unraveling or the so-called age-old hatreds and so on and so forth, they don't actually historicize it in that moment, and they certainly do not connect it with Zionism as a constituting factor in this reality. Instead, sometimes they even present Zionism as an antidote. It is the rational Western, democratic alternative, and in the meantime, look at these Arabs around it. They're chaotic and they hate each other and so on and so forth. So can you please comment on that? Ilan, maybe you have a reading of it based on reading Ussama's book. Maybe Ussama could end with a final comment on that aspect.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. I think it's a very valid point that you are making. Sometimes I think when we talk about the Nakba, we talk about the catastrophe, we tend to focus on the ethnic cleansing itself and the destruction itself, and we don't always reconstruct what was destroyed. And in this respect, it's very clear, and I think Ussama also says it in the book in many ways. The pluralism, which was quite unique actually in Palestine, even compared to Lebanon and Syria, which had a lot to do, and I think there's a lot of new literature about it, around the holy sites like Nabi Rubin and so on, the kind of mystical, religious, ecumenical, but also ecological life, both in the countryside and in the city. That this was the normal way of living in Palestine. And the normal life of the native for a settler colonial movement is one of the most dangerous developments. Dehumanizing the native, which is part of the indigenous population, which is always part of the settler colonial project. In the case of Palestine, meant also destroying this pluralism. I'm not romanticizing this pluralism, but it's a small country, and it's full of evidence from the past that you can reconstruct faithfully a way of life that not only tells you what the Zionist movement had destroyed and why it had destroyed it, which I think is obvious, because it wanted to de-Arabize the country. But we have to unpack de-Arabization here as unpacking that kind of, I would say, one of the best versions of the ecumenical frames that existed in the whole region. but it also gives you at least a hint of what would have happened had Zionism not appeared in Palestine, which I think is an important intellectual exercise that we should be involved in, because when we are envisaging the future, we cannot, of course, anyway, expunge the Jewish population in Israel out of the equation. But if we want to re-enter it in the right frame, into a new, if you want, new Nahda or new ecumenical frame, call it what you want to call it, on coexistence. And Ussama is right. Let's rehabilitate coexistence as a term. It is very clear, for instance, in the case of Jews who live today in Israel, that unless they accept that coexistence is co-resistance to Zionism, there's very little chance for that positive part of that legacy to inform us and inspire us for a better future, which I think can radiate and project and influence areas beyond Palestine in a time of history, which we need that kind of injection. But it is very important. I will finish by just noting that in Palestine, there's a certain legacy that I think goes before the Nahda even. I mean, I'm thinking about Dar el-Omar. I don't know how many of you know that Dar el-Omar thought of Nazareth and Tiberias as empty villages. And he studied the history of those two places. So he goes to Izmir. He meets a Jewish family by the name of Abu Lafia and convinced them to come to Tiberias because he read that Tiberias used to be a place of Jewish learning. And that's how the new Jewish community in Tiberias was formed. Ungratefully, these people joined the Haganah in 48 to expel the people who welcomed them in the 18th century. In a similar way, he resurrected Christian life in Nazareth with a similar kind of idea. So there are roots of this more positive side of the ecumenical frame that were in Palestine even before the so-called Arab, not so-called, the Arab Ottoman intellectuals that Sari is talking about articulated it in a more elegant way, if you want. Thank you. And thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. It's quite late where I am, but kept me, at my late age, you kept me awake, which is a great achievement. You have no idea what a great achievement this is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilan. And thank you, Abed. And thank you, everyone, for your participation, honestly. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Professor Tucker, to Professor Ilan, Professor Ghazal, Professor Pappé, and Professor Makdisi for joining us today. This was really one of the most enjoyable discussions I've had, despite all the technical issues that we confronted. And I recommend to everybody that you go check out the book on the University of California website, on Amazon.com. It'll be perfect for the planners out there, a perfect Christmas present already months in advance. Pre-order it. Thank you, everyone, and have a beautiful rest of the week. And we hope to see you again very soon.